My presentation is on music and the transpersonal experience of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy and how all of that connects us to our inner healing intelligence, which is just sort of an innate healing intelligence that we all have. My interest in this topic, it came because I think music is just inherently interesting. I know, some of you in here better than others, but without doubt, like everybody has a powerful connection to music. It can be incredibly evocative. At different periods in your life, we all have certain songs and different styles of music that really speak to us. And with ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, this quote by Baldwin, he shared that it was as if he had the experience of listening to music for the first time again. And I included that because I had that same experience myself, my first time engaging with CAP. It's often shortened as ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. Just the experience as if it was the very first time. And it was music that I had even heard before, but it was just so immersive and so interesting. And a lot of healing can come from that. And so I wanted to just start with some acknowledgements here. And that's, I'm going to be talking a lot about Western uses of music and psychedelic therapy, but that these sorts of practices have been going on in different parts of the world for literally thousands of years. There are, traditional shamanic uses of music, icaros, drumming, singing, chanting. These are very common. Icaros in particular relate to Amazonian tribes, Shipibo, in the Amazon rainforest. And so, nearly all major religious traditions, if you go back far enough in their history, there's often some form of shamanism and some form of community gathering and song. And so I just want to bring in that piece of the history of this. And then also Mendel Kaelin, he is pretty much the primary researcher on this topic, like specifically examining music and psychedelic therapy. It's really just the last 4 or 5 years or so. And he was a PhD student at the Imperial College of London, where he did a lot of his work. And he's really one of the only people doing this. Jason was my supervisor at the integrative health clinic I have an internship at. I have 2 internships, one at the integrative health clinic where I often offer ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, and one here at Windhorse Elder Care. And then Tammy, who's here today, I have a massive amount of respect for her. She's helped me with traditional therapy skills quite a bit. And then lastly, Stanislav Grof, who I'm about to speak about. He was working with LSD-assisted psychotherapy in the 60s, and he was a pioneer in this field. And, even when he started doing those LSD experiments in the 60s and the 70s, he had an intuition that music was important to bring into this, even though he couldn't exactly say why. And so he's got a couple of quotes here that I think really speak to the 2 central parts of this, which is music and transpersonal experiences. And so he describes music as being like a carrier wave that helps to move patients or clients through the session. And that's really important, that the music just kind of connects you inward to an inner healing intelligence and just non-directively guides the experience. And then he also speaks about transpersonal experiences. And, there's different words that you can use for this. You could use a spiritual experience, an awakening, but, some kind of deeply personal and profound experience that, moves the individual out of their consciousness, out of the usual ego boundaries, the kind of traditional experience of self. And so, I've done a lot of reading about, music and psychedelic therapy, but music on its own is immensely powerful. There's all kinds of sound healing modalities that speak to that. Music has a unique ability to just bypass our logical mind, to bypass our thinking mind, and speak to what's going on in the unconscious. There's so much richness that's percolating just below our, traditional thinking mind. And music can help us tap into that. It can help tap into that emotion and tap into insights that are happening there. So it provides a resting place. It's something for the mind to focus on, and just something for our whole being to focus on. And so importantly, it does it in a non-directive way. It isn't, like a human sitting across from you guiding the experience saying, okay, I want you to tell me about this. I want you to think about this now. It does it in a non-directive way that aligns with the inner healer. And listening to music, just the simple act of receptive listening, just active listening, is very healing in itself. And I found this interesting, that lullabies are one of the very first ways that most of us are taught to soothe and regulate. And we learn that before we learn language. We learn how to attune to our mothers or our primary caregivers through music, which it could be like a pre-form of language. And this is another important piece, that music can facilitate safety. It can lead to a feeling of safety, and access to the emotions. So when we surrender all of our attention to the act of listening, it can we can start to let our guard down a little bit. Kalin says it relaxes the listener. It makes them more present in the here and now, and allows them to feel safe and be able to open up into the experience. And then importantly, it allows spontaneous, meaningful, therapeutic content to merge on its own. So, given enough time, given some spaciousness, and just the act of listening, that like rich content, it comes out on its own often, particularly with an aid of a psychedelic medicine. And then it increases access to emotions. So grief, sadness, love, joy. Many of us, myself included, for long stretches of my life, have a tendency to repress emotion, or maybe repress specific emotions. And music can help put us in touch with some of that again in a therapeutically meaningful way. So in psychedelic modalities, you'll hear a lot of talk about set and setting. And music can be seen as one part of the set and setting. And increasingly, it's being seen to be a very important part of that set and setting. But just to unpack that a little bit, the set is someone's current mental state. And, you can take into account, did someone go through a breakup a few days ago? Did someone recently experience loss? These things will be present with them and may come out in the session. Because, Stan Grof described psychedelics as non-specific amplifiers. And basically the idea there is that they'll amplify those things that are happening in the unconscious, that are just below the conscious mind. So it's important to consider the set and then the setting, which is broadly described as the physical environment of the experience. And this is why a lot of psychedelic therapeutic settings, it looks less like a clinical office and more like a comfy living room, just to kind of create that comfort and that safety. And so then I want to speak about inner healing intelligence some more, which I had already touched on a bit. And this is sort of the core philosophical concept that's at the root of all of this. It's very similar to brilliant sanity, and maybe I'll speak to that later, which brilliant sanity is a core philosophical concept in the contemplative therapy tradition. But inner healing intelligence, it's the idea that we all have that inner healer that we can kind of feel into. It refers to a knowledge and a power within oneself to move towards wholeness and well-being. It's not something that we need to strive for, but under the right conditions, if we create that safety, that stillness, if we can remove certain barriers in our minds and in our clients' minds, this inner healing intelligence can become the expert in the room. And so Shannon Clare, she's a therapist and a leader at MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And she said that just as a seed has within it the knowledge to grow, humans have an innate capacity to heal when in the right environment. So when help is needed to create that environment, therapy, like a greenhouse, can provide a container conducive to healing. Um, and so I really like that greenhouse analogy. And another one that I think really ties this in is if we think about, if you get a cut on your hand, or you get some kind of wound, and you go to a doctor that maybe they stitch it up, they disinfect it, but they don't do the healing itself. They create the conditions so that the healing can happen. And this is how I think therapy can function, and psychedelic therapy and the use of music can function, where, we, like, as a therapist, I'm increasingly seeing my role as, not being some ultimate source of wisdom and healing for clients, and, a more like kind of authoritarian view like that of, I'm going to fix all of their problems, but rather I'm going to work to remove the obstacles that are cluttering their minds, to allow their inner healer to take over. And then we can both really respect and listen to the guidance that's coming from within them. So I'll just briefly share a vignette of one of the clients that I've worked with. And I'll give her the name Jen, that's a pseudonym, but she was a traditional psychotherapy client, so she was not a ketamine client. And I've been working with her for over 6 months now. And she was suffering from anxiety and near daily panic attacks at the beginning of our work. And, through an incredible amount of resilience and personal work that she's done, um, and a really deep commitment to meditation practice and an interest in CBD, which also seemed to help, she's alleviated a lot of that suffering. And she's not having those panic attacks anymore. But she shared with me something that I feel really connects to this topic, and I was really touched to hear. And it's that occasionally when she meditates, and this doesn't always happen, but she'll see a vision of herself in a cave with her spirit guides. So she'll often see, or she'll feel the presence of a bear that's behind her. It's usually just kind of cuddled up, and it feels safe and protective. And to the side, there may be two wolves. And similarly, they just feel safe and protected. And, no one comes in her cave, no human comes in there. But she has done gift-giving ceremonies where people that she's struggled with with different issues in her life, she might bring something that she feels like no longer serves her or serves the relationship. And so it's kind of a giving away. And that just feels like a rich connection to the inner healing intelligence, that this only comes up in an atmosphere of safety. But really interestingly, she also shared that, it doesn't always come up, but the only thing that she sees that she can do to intentionally provoke it, to bring forth this imagery and this visualization, is to listen to music. And specifically, shamanic drumming seems to facilitate access to this. So back to inner healing intelligence, I'd like to invite you, if you feel called, to just close your eyes or just take this in. I'm going to read another quote, and this is also from Shannon Clare. And this is in the context of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. But this is a sample of a statement that she said she might share with a client in a preparatory session. So she said, "We are here to support you and step in to offer help when needed. You are resilient, motivated, and wise. We want to endorse your strengths. We trust your process and ask you to try to do the same. If you come to a place of confusion or overwhelm, please let us know. We are here with you. At that point, we encourage you to take a few breaths, slow down if possible, and see if you can get in touch with the part of you that is connected to insight and clarity. In this work, you may find that more often than not, deep down and with a bit of support and patience, it will become clear what to do or to allow to happen, and you will find many of the answers you seek. A large part of the work is connecting to that place of inner knowing. It's not easy, and there's no one right way to do it, but we are here to help you navigate that process. And I just think that quote is wonderful. It just really speaks to what this is all about, just being there for support, but really honoring the client's internal experience and honoring their inner healer. So I want to speak a bit to, the contrast between traditional psychotherapy and psychedelic therapy. And just even saying traditional psychotherapy, that's so vague and so broad. I mean, there's so many different modalities, and many are more helpful for more specific things. So with an acknowledgement that this is a bit of a generalization, traditional therapy, there's generally more slow and steady progress. Suffering and well-being is typically alleviated and restored over a process of many weeks and months. And in contrast, psychedelic therapy and ketamine-assisted psychotherapy tends to move a little bit more quickly towards treatment goals. Often, my supervisor at the ketamine clinic that I intern at, he shared that he did 17 years of traditional therapy, and he feels that in the last 3 years that he's been a CAT practitioner, he's seen more movement towards treatment goals and resolution of suffering in those 3 years than the 17 combined. And I've heard a lot of stories like that. So this psychedelic therapy, it's kind of being reinvigorated right now. People say it's going through a renaissance after a few decades where little was done. But there seems to be a lot of hope, a lot of potential in some of these modalities. And Kalen shared, for a third of all mental health clients, the therapies and technologies just don't work, which is disappointing, because when someone makes the effort to seek help, to seek treatment, it can be really disappointing to put that effort forward and to not receive help at the end. So I'll talk a little bit more about ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. Ketamine itself, I'm describing it as a psychedelic, and that I think is accurate, but technically it's a dissociative anesthetic, and it's been used since the 1960s. It's been approved by the FDA since the 1960s in that context. So CAP is actually, it's an off-label use. And it's being used at about a third to a fourth of the dose that would be used in an anesthetic setting. So it's less of a dose. And basically what happens is when it's taken at that sub-anesthetic dose, that's when you start to get some of these transpersonal experiences and psychedelic experiences. But it's considered physiological safe, and it's on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines, which means all hospitals should have it in stock. It has incredible efficacy, and more and more recent studies have been demonstrating this in treating treatment-resistant depression, which is defined as depression. So someone who has depression and has used antidepressant medication like SSRIs or some kind of therapy, and usually 2 courses of that, and the depression remains. That's treatment-resistant depression. So that and suicidal ideation, those are 2 of the biggest conditions that it's really helpful at treating, but also obsessive compulsive disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. And there's some other conditions. It's increasingly demonstrating efficacy in treating. But yeah, I'll just focus on depression right now, the treatment-resistant depression, because it just blows my mind. So people who have suffered and have tried and failed to treat it before, in 70% of those people who receive ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, they will have a statistically significant response, and 40% will have a complete remission of their depression, which that just kind of blows my mind, and I think it really speaks to how potentially healing this modality can be. Before I speak to the medical model, actually, yeah. So I've had the experience of being at the ketamine clinic that I intern at, and I did receive ketamine once there, and the experience of afterwards having a therapist there that I could process and integrate some of the things that came up. And then I've also had the experience of going to a place that followed a more medical model. And by that, what I mean is a place that basically is hoping that the healing will come from the ketamine itself, and that further therapeutic exploration isn't needed. And so a place like this might have LCD screens, so like television screens that you just kind of go into a room, they sit you down in a comfy recliner, they administer the ketamine, and they hope for the best. There's no therapy component. And so there is some, physical explanations for why people recover from depression. Like ketamine does increase neurogenesis and neuroplasticity in the brain, which means essentially it increases the quantity and the quality of neuronal connections. So there is a physical basis for this. But then it's also been demonstrated in some of these studies that clients who received ketamine in hospitals and were able to hear, nurses and doctors coming and going, they did not receive as high of reductions in their depression as clients who, were in a more comfortable office and were listening to music. Music in itself increased reductions in depression. So basically, clients who received more of those transpersonal experiences received greater reductions in depression. And yeah, so in the medical model, the dissociative psychedelic experience that the client has, it can be seen as an unwanted and unpleasant side effect. So, they can try to minimize that or reduce that. And I'll just share a quote that speaks to the opposite of that, which this is from Becker. The rich archetypal experience that ketamine treatment brings is an opportunity for growth rather than a negative side effect to be managed or suffered through. And importantly, at the end here, he says, I've come to regard that it is unlikely that patients heal in spite of the acute psychological effects, but rather they heal because of them. And so, they're currently, Johnson & Johnson just received approval to go forward with, it's called S-ketamine. It's a different formulation of ketamine where, they're different pharmaceutical companies essentially are trying to remove some of these transpersonal experiences and just, rather than this model of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy where you have maybe 6 to 8 treatments spread out over a couple of months and then you're done and you don't need to keep doing it all the time. They're trying to devise ways where you don't have those experiences, but you take it every day. So it's like another pharmaceutical treatment. So clearly I have some opinions about that, and maybe we could speak to that at the end if anyone has any questions. But I'll just share here some of the transpersonal experiences that people have in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. So ego dissolution, changes to identity, feelings of actually having left the body, connecting to a previously pure state. That's a fairly common one that I've seen. And a really, deeply personal one and inspiring. A deep feeling of connection to the universe and to all sentient beings, seeing religious entities and feeling like you receive wisdom from them. Carl Jung suggested that our egos need to have a connection with the inner divine self. And ketamine-assisted psychotherapy is a way to almost have that experience like clockwork. Like it's really profound to, traditionally people from a variety of different spiritual traditions might have powerful experiences at some point or another that come about through years of practice or maybe even just by chance. But to induce this almost, on demand, like it's really powerful when approached with intention and respect. So I'll just briefly share about another vignette. And this is a client that I had at the ketamine clinic. And again, her name has been changed to protect her privacy. But so she did go through 8 ketamine sessions and integration sessions, because we often meet with clients for preparatory sessions, and then before their first ketamine session, and then a traditional psychotherapy integration session after each one. And so she had this experience of an interaction with a powerful and pure animal and a return to a previously pure state, where this was a theme that came up throughout her sessions, where, in her experience, she would see herself in nature, and just with a big smile on her face, and, overlooking a cliff or in a deep forest. And then towards the end, she was starting to see herself connecting with what she saw as her tribe. And she was dancing, and, she was feeling the music and hearing the music, and she was dancing and just felt deeply at peace and connected. She also had some insights around, seeing her husband's own depression and how he was suffering, and how, that was influencing their marriage. And she, deeply felt the grief of her father's passing from a year ago that had kind of been on her mind, but was unresolved. And so she was able to feel into that more and work with that. And then she had an experience of becoming a rock, which is it seems like it could just be an arbitrary thing. And, this is the kind of experience that maybe in the medical model, like, oh yeah, you were having this experience of profundity, and then you were a rock, and yeah, this is all just crazy, like none of it mattered, like it could be dismissed. But in the integration sessions afterwards, like, we saw that, it connected to this ongoing theme of expansiveness and restriction that she was experiencing, where she was seeing herself connected to nature and then kind of refined in man-made structures. And then with the rock, there was an experience of like deliriousness that it connected to a dream that she had when she was a teenager. And so, we kind of unpacked that a bit. But these sorts of experiences in a more medical model, it can actually cause harm to have these things come up and then to have them be dismissed. But yeah, Cassandra, she reconnected to a core source of inner strength. She reconnected with that ability to heal. And she did really profoundly. She, within a couple of sessions, she reconnected with higher levels of energy, and, reported much improved mood, and that persisted. So yeah, returning to music and ketamine-assisted therapy and psychedelic therapy, this study was actually looking at psilocybin mushrooms. And this is the one that really caught my eye in the beginning. And it was only from a few years ago. But in this study, it was found that the quality of the music, basically the clients, how they rated their experience of openness to the music and how much they found they enjoyed the music, that was more descriptive in reductions in depression than the dose of the psilocybin mushrooms itself, which is just fascinating to me. Like, the music had a stronger effect than the actual dose of the psychedelic. And that was in reductions in depression a week later. And then in follow-up interviews, clients spoke more to that. So Kalin, he kind of summarizes 4 main motivations for music use, and we've kind of discussed some of these already. But so to facilitate peak experiences, it was demonstrated that music, when used appropriately, it can facilitate peak experiences, these transpersonal experiences. Likewise, it can increase access to emotions, and emotional release can be brought forward. And then autobiographical processing and mental imagery. That basically, it means that you can have a greater recall of past things that happened. And that one was particularly found in MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, where things that happened decades ago, people were surprised at how well they were able to recall things. And it was found that the music, clients that listen to music were able to do that better than those who did not. And then lastly, it provides reassurance and safety. It helps to lower those barriers and to allow that connection to the inner healer. So yeah, people are often really curious about what types of music are used in psychedelic therapy. And, really the answer is it depends on the person and some of their preferences. And it also depends on the psychedelic that's being used. But a lot of different genres have been tried. Classical music, Western art music, all of these different things have been used. And for some people, each of these have been found to be effective. But interestingly, the music does not need to be particularly trippy, which is what a lot of people tend to think. But it's more important that it evokes emotional experiences while not being too pushy in the types of experiences that it evokes. So if you're trying too hard to just create a whole playlist of sorrow, maybe that's not what the client needs. Maybe at that time, inside the client is reconnecting with joy and some past memories of love and, whatever it may be. So you want to have a mix of, like my supervisor often says, he likes to have light and dark, different types of music in there. And if it's all joy and it's all happy the whole time, that doesn't really provide an opportunity to do shadow work, which is also important. So it can be good to have some heavier music in there. With ketamine-assisted psychotherapy in particular, like ambient sort of spacious music really shines through in that space. Ketamine can have a sort of floaty quality to it. And, electronic artists like carbon-based life forms, it's like quintessential cat music. But then, some clients might not like electronic music, which is fine. And so a client like that might instead prefer soft orchestral music, maybe a violin or something like that. So we have different playlists, and we like to always check in with clients afterwards and in before a session starts, like talk to them. How did you like the music from last time? What would you like this time? But ideally, the music will have little to no words in English if the client is an English speaker, because that can take away. And then another consideration is familiar music. It can be, maybe I'll talk about more about that later, but depending on the medicine, it can be good to avoid familiar music, because maybe one song to a certain person, they associate it with a breakup, or they associate it with something that provokes one particular type of emotional response. And then again, in their session, maybe that's not what's coming up. So then that song comes on and it pushes them into that emotional response. And maybe that's actually disruptive to their internal experience. The role of the psychedelic therapist in the session is to create an ideal set and setting. That's very important. You always want to consider that. And then to show up with warmth and, what the humanistic early therapist Carl Rogers would describe as unconditional positive regard, just meeting what is brought. And so, always honoring a client's inner healing intelligence and their brilliant sanity, and recognizing, like, even, if in a particular moment it doesn't seem like they're in touch with it, that it's still there, and that, maybe through some therapeutic interventions, you can help to align them with that. But to almost always engage in a non-directive way. And I say almost always because, sometimes maybe a client is doing something harmful, or maybe just something that isn't helpful. And so then maybe it is helpful to guide them and to maybe encourage them to feel inward, maybe to take a break from talking and to feel inward, or whatever it may be, but to generally be non-directive in the approach. And then it's good to have playlists that are ready and that can run on their own in case, a longer intervention is needed. So you want to be able to change the music as needed, but also have it be able to run on its own. And then, you don't want cords in the way. You want to position the audio equipment so it's accessible, but it's not a barrier. It's not too obvious. If a client gets up and wants to go to the bathroom, they're not going to trip on something. Yeah, and so lastly, breaks in the music can be a good move. And this is a little bit less true with ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, partly because ketamine is a very quick experience. The classical psychedelics, they're usually described as, LSD, ayahuasca, psilocybin mushrooms, DMT. They tend to be longer. And so, there's periods of being deep in the music and then talking to the therapist. With ketamine, more so, it's about an hour is the peak of the experience. And so usually they've got headphones on, they've got eye shades on, and they just lay down and get comfortable and enjoy the experience, or be with the experience. Often enjoy it. But so with some other psychedelics, there might be breaks, and you might strategically use them. And, that speaks to kind of the contemplative methodology as well. Because music is it's a therapeutic tool. And like all therapeutic tools, Kalen says, you should be informed by when and when not to use it. And so clients might be irritated if there's a sudden break in the music. So it's good to prompt them that that's something that could happen. So there's a ton more work that could be done analyzing music and psychedelic therapy and how best to use it. This is very, very early in the Western world of being studied scientifically. Like really the last 5 years is where specifically studies have been done. So lots of different stuff and focusing on different types of music for each psychedelic. I think that's an interesting direction. Like I mentioned, most of Kalen's work was done on the classical psychedelics. Not a whole lot has been done on ketamine specifically, but anecdotally, a lot of people do report that kind of ambient, spacious, sort of floaty type of music is effective in that space. Yeah, the role of personally significant music, that's another good thing to take a look at. And then lastly, cultural considerations. Most of this music that's listened to in these sessions, it's created by and it's listened to by mostly Europeans and North Americans. So I think it would be really important to examine, cross-culturally, does this all hold up? And what other things might be at play there? So maybe I'll just take a break here and see if there's any questions.